The amplifier hum was the only sound in the room. A low electric murmur vibrating through the floorboards of a Greenwich Village apartment, where the air smelled of cigarette smoke, cheap wine, and the particular tension that fills a space when two forces of nature are about to collide. It was late 1968, and somewhere in that small room, a white Fender Stratocaster leaned against the wall like a loaded weapon nobody had fired yet. But the instrument was not the most dangerous thing in the room. The most dangerous thing was a question that one of the greatest musical minds of the 20th century was about to ask the most revolutionary guitarist alive. And the answer would not come in words. But before that question was asked, before the chord that should not have worked somehow changed two careers forever, something else had to happen first. Something quieter and in many ways more important. New York City in the autumn of 1968 was a place caught between endings and beginnings. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April. Robert Kennedy was shot in June. Vietnam was grinding forward, body counts scrolling across evening news broadcasts like terrible weather reports. Music, which had once promised peace and understanding, was struggling to keep up with the speed of the crisis. The folk singers had gone electric. The electric players had gone psychedelic. And now the psychedelic movement was beginning to fragment into heavier, louder, more experimental directions that nobody could predict. In the middle of all this, two musicians were on parallel trajectories that most people assumed would never intersect. One had spent 2 decades reshaping jazz from the inside, pushing it from bebop to cool to modal to something that did not even have a proper name yet. The other had spent barely 2 years in the spotlight and had already demolished the accepted boundaries of what an electric guitar could do. Miles Davis was 42 years old. Jimi Hendrix was 25. And according to the musical categories that critics and record labels used to organize the world, they had absolutely nothing in common. But categories are invented by people who need to sell records, not by people who need to make music. Miles Davis did not arrive at that Greenwich Village gathering by accident. Nothing Miles did was accidental. He had been listening. For months, he had been hearing things that disturbed him, excited him, and confused him in roughly equal measure. His wife at the time, Betty Davis, had been playing records that Miles would never have chosen himself. Jimi Hendrix records, Sly Stone records, James Brown records. The sounds were raw, distorted, electric in ways that jazz had never been, built on rhythms that hit the body before they reached the brain. Miles would walk through the living room pretending not to listen. But he was always listening. That was the thing about Miles Davis that most people misunderstood. They saw the cool exterior, the sunglasses, the legendary silences, and they assumed arrogance. Some of it was arrogance. Miles had earned that right. He had changed the direction of American music at least 3 times by 1968. But the silences were not empty. They were full of listening. Miles processed music the way certain predators process movement, constantly scanning, evaluating, deciding what mattered and what was noise. And something in Jimi Hendrix's guitar playing was registering as important. Not the pyrotechnics, not the showmanship, not the burning guitars. Something underneath. A harmonic sensibility that Miles recognized as more sophisticated than most critics were willing to admit. But recognition is not the same as respect. Not yet. Miles needed to test it. The gathering that night was one of those informal musician meetings that happened constantly in the village. Someone's apartment, some instruments, cheap drinks, no agenda except music. The kind of evening where legends bumped into legends and nobody took notes because nobody knew they were supposed to. Jimi had been in New York for several months, living the strange double life of sudden fame. During the day, the international rock star dealing with managers and contracts. At night, something else entirely. At night, Jimi became the musician he had always been, the quiet, obsessive listener who sat in on jam sessions at tiny clubs, who played for hours with strangers, who sought out every style of music because he believed all of it was connected. Jazz fascinated him. It always had. Before London, before the experience, Jimi had spent years on the road playing rhythm and blues, backing artists on the Chitlin circuit, absorbing the language of Black American music in all its forms. He had listened to jazz the way a medical student studies anatomy, Not just the surface but the deep structures, how chords moved, how harmony created tension and release. But the jazz world did not know this. The jazz world saw a rock guitarist. A loud one. With a big afro and flashy clothes and a Stratocaster he played with his teeth and sometimes set on fire. If you were a jazz musician in 1968, that was not serious. Miles arrived late, which was typical. He entered with the particular energy that rearranged every room he walked into. Dark clothes, precise. His trumpet case in his hand, though he had not decided whether he would play. He scanned the apartment and found Jimi almost immediately. The guitarist was sitting on a couch near the window, holding his white Stratocaster loosely, listening to a conversation about John Coltrane. He was not participating. He was absorbing everything quietly, with that unsettling intensity that people who knew him recognized as his natural state. For the first hour, nothing remarkable happened. People played. Small groups formed and dissolved. The music was good but not extraordinary. Miles watched. Jimi listened. Neither played. Then, around 1 in the morning, something shifted. The casual jam wound down. The room was quieter. Someone asked Miles to play. Miles looked at his trumpet for a long moment, then looked across the room at Jimi. There are different accounts of what Miles said next. The exact words have been filtered through decades of retelling. But the essence, documented in multiple biographical accounts, is consistent. Miles addressed Jimi directly. His voice carried that quality it always had, quiet but impossible to ignore. He wanted to hear what the guitarist could do, not the rock star version, not the stage show. He wanted to hear what happened when you stripped away the volume and the spectacle and just played. Real music. Harmony. The language that separated musicians who understood the architecture of sound from those who simply made noise. Jimi did not react defensively. He simply nodded, the way someone nods when they have been waiting for exactly this invitation without knowing they were waiting. Miles sat at the small upright piano pushed against the wall. This surprises people who think of Miles only as a trumpet player. But Miles was a sophisticated harmonic thinker who understood the piano as a compositional tool. He placed his fingers on the keys and played a chord. It was not a simple chord. Accounts describe it as something from the outer reaches of jazz harmony. A voicing that stacked intervals in ways that created maximum tension, maximum ambiguity. The kind of chord that jazz students spend semesters analyzing, that contains multiple possible resolutions, none of them obvious, all demanding a sophisticated ear to navigate. It was a test. Everyone understood that immediately. Miles Davis had thrown down a harmonic gauntlet. He had given Jimi Hendrix a musical problem with no easy solution, a chord that would expose whether the rock guitarist actually understood harmony or was hiding behind volume and the blues scale that every guitar player learns in their first year. The room went silent. Not gradually, but instantly. Jimi looked at his Stratocaster. He looked at Miles. He looked at his own hands. Then he began to play. The first notes were exploratory. Not uncertain, but careful, the way a climber tests a handhold before committing weight. His fingers moved across the fretboard with a delicacy that contradicted every expectation. This was not the slashing, aggressive attack that audiences heard at concerts. This was listening made audible. He played a single note that hung in the air, bending slightly, vibrating with a warmth that acknowledged the complexity of what Miles had played without trying to resolve it immediately. Then another note a half step away, creating a dissonance that should have been uncomfortable but was not. Jimi was feeling the interior architecture of the chord with his fingertips, mapping its tensions and possibilities the way a blind person maps a face through touch. Miles watched without expression. But those who knew him could see something behind his eyes, a calculation being revised. Jimi played a phrase of perhaps 6 notes, each chosen with surgical precision, each addressing a different tension within the chord, each revealing that he understood not just what the chord was but what it wanted to become. The phrase did not resolve the harmony. It opened it further, suggesting directions that even Miles had not considered. A jazz pianist set down his drink. A bassist stood up straighter. The rock guitarist was speaking jazz, not imitating it, speaking it with an accent they had never heard before, an accent that came from the blues, from rhythm and blues, from the raw electric tradition that jazz musicians had spent years dismissing as unsophisticated. Miles played another chord, harder this time, more dissonant, a voicing that contained what theorists call a tritone substitution layered over an altered dominant, the kind of harmonic construction that separates professionals from amateurs, that reveals in seconds whether a musician understands the deep grammar of Western harmony. Jimi did not pause. His response was immediate, fluid, organic. His fingers found notes that belonged to the chord but also transcended it, notes in the spaces between conventional harmonic categories. He was not playing inside the chord or outside it. He was playing through it, treating it not as a puzzle to be solved but as a landscape to be explored. Then Jimi began to improvise freely. His Stratocaster, plugged into a small practice amplifier at conversational volume, produced sounds that seemed impossible for the setup. No effects pedals, no distortion. Just the pure, clean tone of wood and wire and electricity, shaped by fingers that understood the instrument at a molecular level. He played lines that wove through Miles's harmony like thread through fabric. Complex melodic ideas that acknowledged the jazz tradition without being bound by it. Phrases that referenced the blues but extended into harmonic territory that had no name. Miles listened, and listening was the highest compliment Miles Davis ever paid anyone. For perhaps 5 minutes, the two engaged in a musical conversation that no one recorded. Miles would play a chord, Jimi would respond. Jimi would suggest a melodic direction, Miles would follow or redirect. It had started as a test, but somewhere in the first minute, it became a collaboration between two minds operating at the same level of musical intelligence despite coming from entirely different traditions. There was a moment when Jimi played a sequence of chords, voicings that used the guitar's unique tonal properties to create textures a piano could not replicate. Jazz chords, sophisticated extensions and alterations, voiced in ways specific to the guitar, taking advantage of its ability to bend notes, to let strings ring against each other, creating overtones that added layers of complexity to even simple ideas. Miles stopped playing piano. He picked up his trumpet for the first time that evening, and he began to play over Jimi's chords. The sound of Miles Davis's trumpet floating over Jimi Hendrix's guitar in that small apartment is something those present describe as one of the most beautiful things they ever heard. Two completely different timbres, two traditions, two approaches to the fundamental question of what music is, finding common ground in real time, without rehearsal, without arrangement, without safety nets. Miles played long, sustained notes above Jimi's shifting harmonies. His tone was intimate, conversational, stripped of performance brilliance, reduced to its essential quality, a human voice through brass. Jimi supported him with a harmonic sensitivity that revealed years of listening, years of absorbing jazz harmony through records and late-night radio, and the kind of obsessive musical study that does not require formal education because it is driven by something more powerful than curriculum. The improvisation lasted perhaps 10 minutes total. When it ended naturally, the way a conversation between old friends ends, not with a dramatic conclusion but with a gradual settling. Jimi played a final chord, a simple major voicing that resolved all the complex tensions, like a deep breath after sustained exertion. Miles played one last note, a single tone that sat perfectly within Jimi's chord, that completed it with a fullness neither instrument could achieve alone. Then silence, the kind of silence that follows something sacred. Miles set his trumpet down. He looked at Jimi. Jimi looked back, his face showing only the quiet exhaustion that follows intense creative effort. According to those present, Miles nodded. Just once. A small, precise movement that contained more approval than a standing ovation. In the vocabulary of Miles Davis, a nod meant he had heard something real. What happened next is perhaps more significant than the music. Miles walked over and sat down next to Jimi. For the next hour, while the party resumed around them, they talked. About harmony. About the chords Miles had played and the responses Jimi had found. About where jazz and blues and rock overlapped and where they diverged. About the sounds that existed in the spaces between genres that nobody had claimed yet. Miles asked about Jimi's harmonic vocabulary. Where had he learned those voicings, those substitutions, those melodic ideas that wove through complex changes with such natural fluidity? Jimmy's answer was characteristically simple. He listened to records. Everything. Jazz, blues, classical, music from other countries and other centuries. He listened until the underlying patterns became visible, until the grammar of harmony revealed itself not as rules to memorize but as a living language to speak. Miles recognized something in this that resonated with his own experience. Miles had formal training. He had attended the Juilliard School. But the music that mattered had not come from classrooms. It had come from sitting in clubs on 52nd Street as a teenager, absorbing Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, letting music enter through his ears and exit through his horn, transformed by whatever mysterious process turns influence into originality. Jimmy had done the same from a different starting point. The Chitlin Circuit instead of 52nd Street. Years backing other musicians instead of Juilliard. The destinations differed, but the journey was the same. Both men had learned music by immersion, by opening themselves to the current and letting it carry them. That evening changed things. Miles, who had already been listening to rock and funk, began moving more decisively toward the direction that would produce some of his most controversial and influential work. The recordings he made in the coming years reflected a new willingness to embrace the electric, the raw, the rhythmically aggressive elements he had heard in Jimmy's playing. For Jimmy, the encounter confirmed something he had always believed, that his music was not separate from the jazz tradition, that the complex harmonies in his head were not accidents but expressions of deep musical intelligence crossing genre boundaries. He had been validated by the most demanding ear in American music. In the months that followed, there were discussions about collaboration. According to biographical accounts, Miles and Jimmy talked about recording together, creating music in the space between their worlds. The logistics were complicated, the schedules impossible, the contracts with different labels. But the artistic intent was real. It never happened. In September of 1970, Jimi Hendrix died in London. He was 27 years old. The collaboration that could have redefined American music remained unrealized. One of the great unfinished stories in the history of recorded sound. Miles did not speak publicly about Jimmy's death for some time, but in later interviews across the remaining decades of his career, he would reference Jimmy in ways that revealed the depth of that encounter's impact. He spoke about Jimmy not as a rock guitarist but as a musician, period. He described the harmonic intelligence he had witnessed, the ability to navigate complex changes without formal training, the intuitive understanding of musical architecture that most conservatory graduates never achieve. He spoke about Jimmy the way he spoke about very few people, with a respect reserved for those who had genuinely surprised him. Music historians trace lines of influence between that period and the directions both artists pursued. Miles's electric recordings carried echoes of what he heard in Jimmy's playing. The raw energy, the willingness to embrace distortion as expression, the rhythmic intensity owing more to James Brown than Charlie Parker. These elements Miles had been moving toward, but his encounter with Jimmy accelerated the journey, gave it permission. And Jimmy's later work showed increasing harmonic sophistication, a reaching toward jazz. The unfinished recordings and late-night jam sessions captured on tape reveal an artist moving beyond the boundaries of rock towards something larger, something that might eventually have brought direct collaboration with the very jazz musicians who had initially dismissed him. No recording equipment was present that night. No tape rolled. No photographs captured the two musicians playing together. The music existed only in the memories of those who were there, memories shaped and reshaped by decades of retelling until specific details became uncertain even as the emotional truth became more vivid. But what remains clear across every account is this. That night, two of the most important musicians of the 20th century recognized each other, not as representatives of different genres or generations, but as fellow travelers toward the center of what music actually is. Miles threw down a challenge built from decades of harmonic knowledge. Jimmy answered with an intuition so deep it made theory feel like a rough sketch of something he could see in full color. And in that exchange, something happened that neither formal education nor raw talent could produce alone. Two kinds of musical intelligence merged briefly, and in that merging, both men glimpsed a future for music bigger than either could build on their own. Miles spent the rest of his career reaching toward that future. Jimmy ran out of time before he could get there. But the conversation they started that night, heard by 15 people and remembered imperfectly by all of them, proved that the boundaries between musical worlds are imaginary lines drawn by people who have never stood at the place where those worlds meet. Sometimes the most important music is the music nobody hears. And sometimes the most profound test is not the one that exposes weakness, but the one that reveals a strength so deep it changes the person who designed the test in the first place.